A woman, 38 years old, mother of two. She had eaten bread that morning, the same bread she bought every week from the same bakery on the same street. By midday, she did not know where she was. By mid-afternoon, she did not know who her children were. She stood at her front door and called out names, but not their names. Names that meant nothing to anyone in the house. When her husband came to her, she looked at his face for a long moment and then she screamed. Not out of pain, out of certainty. She was certain, completely and without any doubt, that the man standing in front of her was not her husband. That something had come into her home wearing his face. He held her wrists on the hallway floor and told her she was safe and that he loved her and that everything was going to be fine. He said this for 6 hours. She fought him for most of it. By the time a doctor reached their house, she had been awake for over 30 hours without a single moment of recognizing the world around her as real. Down the street and across town and in houses all the way to the edge of Pont Saint-Esprit, 200 people were lost inside the same darkness. And before it was over, 5 of them would not find their way back out. To know what happened, we need to go back 9 days. Go back to a Tuesday in August when the town of Pont Saint-Esprit was exactly what it had always been. Pont Saint-Esprit sits on the western bank of the Rhône River in southern France. In 1951, it had roughly 4,000 residents. It was not a famous town. It was not a wealthy town. It was the kind of place where people bought their bread from the same baker their parents had used, where everyone recognized each other on the street, where the rhythms of daily life were so settled and familiar that nothing about an ordinary Tuesday in August would have felt worth remembering. The baker's name was Roch Briand. His shop stood on one of the main streets and served a large portion of the town. In the second week of August 1951, Briand received a delivery of flour. This was completely routine. Flour arrived regularly. He stored it and used it the way he always did. Between August 16 and August 18, he baked several batches of bread and sold them to his customers. The bread looked normal. It smelled normal. People bought it, carried it home, and ate it with their families. By August 20, people were getting sick. The first wave of symptoms was easy to dismiss. Nausea, stomach cramps, vomiting. In a town of 4,000 people eating from many of the same food sources, a cluster of upset stomachs did not immediately suggest catastrophe. The local doctors treated it as a gastrointestinal bug, something moving through the community, something that would burn itself out in a few days. It did not burn out, it got worse. By August 22, the symptoms had shifted into territory that the doctors had no easy explanation for. People who had started with stomach pain were now reporting that their skin felt like it was crawling. Some described a deep burning sensation in their hands and feet. Others said their limbs felt frozen. One woman told her doctor she felt like something was moving beneath her skin. A farmer said he could not feel his fingers. A man in his 50s said the walls of his bedroom were breathing. Dr. Gabai, one of the local physicians, began keeping a record of every household he visited. He wrote down the symptoms. He wrote down what people had eaten. And very early in that process, before he had any clear theory, he noticed something. Almost every sick person he visited had bought bread recently from the same place, from Briand's bakery. He circled that detail in his notes and kept moving, because there were more houses to visit and the list was growing. Then came the night of August 24. What had been a manageable, if alarming, outbreak turned into something else entirely after dark. People who had seemed stable that afternoon became completely unreachable by evening. The confusion that had been building for days broke open into full delusion. A man tried to climb out of a second-floor window because he was convinced snakes were moving up the exterior walls toward him. A teenager barricaded herself in her bedroom and pushed furniture against the door. An elderly man walked out of his house at midnight and could not explain where he thought he was going. When his son caught up with him and asked him to come home, the old man did not recognize the word home as meaning anything. By 4 in the morning on August 25, people were in the streets. Some were running. Some were sitting on the ground unable to move. Some were talking to things that were not there. Neighbors who came outside to see what was happening stood on their doorsteps and watched and did not know what to do, because what they were seeing did not fit inside any category of normal human illness they had ever encountered. And somewhere in a hallway on one of those streets, a husband was sitting on the floor holding his wife's wrists, telling her she was safe, while she looked at his face and saw a stranger. Dr. Gabay called the hospital in Nims before sunrise. He told them he had a situation he could not classify: multiple patients, severe hallucinations, convulsions, people who could not be reasoned with, could not be calmed, and in some cases could not be physically controlled. He needed medical support immediately. He needed it in volume, and he needed someone with more answers than he had, because right now he had almost none. The hospital in Nims responded and sent personnel and supplies. But by the time any organized outside help arrived in Pont Saint-Esprit, the town's small local hospital was already overwhelmed. Patients were in the corridors. Patients were in the waiting areas. Some were strapped to beds because they were thrashing violently enough to hurt themselves. Nurses were moving between rooms trying to manage people who did not understand where they were or why they were being restrained. The hallucinations were unlike anything the medical staff had encountered. Patients described fire that gave off no heat, animals climbing the walls, figures standing in the corners of rooms that disappeared when anyone else looked at them. Several patients were convinced they were shrinking. One man asked a nurse to confirm that the ceiling was not lowering itself toward him. Another patient grabbed a doctor's arm and begged him to make the floor stop moving, because to that patient, the floor was rising and falling like the surface of water. 5 people died. The deaths changed the response immediately. French health ministry officials arrived in Pont Saint-Esprit. The town was effectively closed off. Journalists came not long after and began filing reports about what some were already calling the village of the damned. The phrase spread fast. The official investigation began the way most investigations begin, with a map. Health investigators sat down with the case records and began plotting who was sick and where they lived and what they had eaten and where they had bought it. They went house to house. They asked the same questions repeatedly. What did you eat on August 16? What did you eat on August 17? Where did you buy your bread? Who else in your household ate from the same loaf? The map that emerged from this process was not ambiguous. The sick were concentrated among the customers of one bakery, Brian's Bakery. People who had bought bread there between August 16 and August 18 were sick. People who had not bought bread there were largely fine. There were a small number of exceptions, but the pattern held firmly enough that investigators knew within the first few days of the official inquiry exactly where to focus. Brian's Bakery was shut down. Every remaining ingredient on the premises was seized and packaged for laboratory testing. The bread that had not yet been sold was collected. Samples of flour were taken from the storage area. Brian himself was interviewed at length. He did not resist. He answered every question. He said the flour had arrived in a recent delivery. He said he had not noticed anything wrong with it. He said he had no idea anything was wrong at all until customers began collapsing. The samples went to laboratories, and the laboratories found something. They found traces of compounds associated with ergot. Ergot is a fungus. It grows on rye and on other cereal grains under certain conditions, particularly in wet seasons when humidity is high and grain is not properly dried or stored. It has been documented since medieval times. In the Middle Ages, whole villages suffered from a condition that came to be called ergotism. People who ate bread made from ergot-contaminated grain developed hallucinations, convulsions, a burning sensation in their skin, and in severe cases, a form of gangrene that turned the limbs black and caused them to wither. Historically, this condition was sometimes called St. Anthony's fire, named for the burning feeling that patients described. The symptoms of ergotism matched the symptoms of Pont Saint-Esprit almost exactly. French health authorities released their official conclusion. The flour used at Brian's Bakery had been contaminated with ergot. The bread made from that flour had caused a mass outbreak of ergotism. The case was closed. But several people who had worked on the investigation were not ready to close it. The first problem was with the laboratory results themselves. Ergot poisoning severe enough to produce the scale of neurological collapse seen in Pont-Saint-Esprit would require a very high concentration of the fungus in the grain. The flour samples that were tested showed ergot-related compounds, but not all of them showed the concentration levels that toxicologists expected to find given the severity of what 200 people had experienced. Some results were inconsistent with others. There were questions about which samples had been collected, how they had been stored before testing, and whether the testing methods used were comprehensive enough to capture everything present in the flour. The second problem was geographic. Ergot contamination of a flour supply typically originates at the grain source, meaning a contaminated harvest would affect multiple mills and multiple bakers drawing from the same supply. But the outbreak in Pont-Saint-Esprit was tightly concentrated around one bakery. Other bakers in the surrounding area who had received flour from the same mill reported no such outbreak among their customers. If the contamination was in the regional flour supply, why was Brian's bakery essentially the only place where people were destroyed by it? Investigators explored whether Brian had stored his flour in conditions that allowed additional fungal growth. This was a possibility. Improper storage in humid conditions can accelerate mold and fungal development, but this was never definitively established. No one proved that Brian's storage was significantly different from standard practice for a bakery of that size and era. Dr. Jean Vieux, a physician who had worked directly with patients during the outbreak, began publishing his doubts. He wrote that the concentrations of ergot alkaloids supported by the forensic evidence did not, in his professional assessment, account for the severity and the specific character of the neurological symptoms he had witnessed. He raised these questions not once but repeatedly over the years that followed, and he was not alone in raising them. The official conclusion stood, but the doubts did not go away. They went quiet for a while. Then, in 2009, they came back louder than ever. A journalist named Hank Albarelli published a book. He had spent years working through documents obtained from American government agencies under Freedom of Information Act requests. Among those documents, he found references that he believed connected the CIA to the events in Pont-Saint-Esprit in August 1951. What Albarelli was pointing toward was a CIA program that would eventually become known as MKUltra. This program, which ran from the early 1950s into the 1970s, involved covert experimentation with mind-altering substances. The CIA was interested in whether chemicals could be used to disorient enemies, extract information, or manipulate behavior. LSD was one of the substances they were studying intensively in this period. It had been synthesized in 1938 by a Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann, and its extreme psychological potency, at very small doses, made it immediately interesting to intelligence services on multiple sides of the Cold War. Albarelli's claim was direct. He argued that Pont-Saint-Esprit had been used as a covert field test, that LSD had been deliberately introduced into the food supply of that small French town without the knowledge or consent of anyone living there, that the hallucinations, the delusions, the violence, and the deaths were not an accident of fungal contamination, but the result of an intentional experiment conducted by American intelligence operatives on an unsuspecting civilian population. He connected this claim to a specific individual, a man named Frank Olson. Frank Olson was real. He was a biochemist who worked for the United States Army and collaborated with the CIA on research involving LSD and other substances in the early 1950s. In November 1953, Olson fell from a window of the Statler Hotel in New York City and died. For more than 2 decades, his death was officially recorded as a suicide. Then in 1975, a government commission investigating CIA activities revealed that Olson had been secretly dosed with LSD by CIA operatives without his knowledge shortly before his death. His family demanded answers. His body was exhumed in 1994, and a forensic examination found evidence suggesting he had been struck on the head before going through the window. The medical examiner who conducted the examination concluded the manner of death was unknown, not suicide. Frank Olson's case became one of the most contested and troubling episodes in the history of American intelligence, and Albarelli placed him in the vicinity of France in 1951. The documents Albarelli presented were real documents. Whether they meant what he said they meant was the question that divided researchers. Critics examined the same papers and argued that the references he interpreted as pointing to Pont Saint-Esprit were ambiguous enough to mean other things entirely. Intelligence documents from this period are frequently written in language designed to obscure meaning. What looks like a reference to one event can sometimes be a reference to something else coded in similar terms. French authorities dismissed the CIA theory. Most mainstream historians sided with the ergot explanation while acknowledging its forensic gaps. Toxicologists pointed out a chemically significant problem with the LSD theory. LSD and ergot are related compounds. LSD is derived from lysergic acid, which itself comes from ergot. They share a chemical family, but they affect the body very differently. LSD at high doses causes profound psychological disturbance, but does not typically produce the vascular effects that ergot causes. Ergot alkaloids constrict blood vessels. That constriction reduces blood flow to the extremities, which explains the burning sensation in the limbs, and in the most severe cases, the gangrenous symptoms that some Pont Saint-Esprit patients experienced. Several victims of the outbreak did develop gangrenous symptoms. Their limbs darkened. Blood flow was compromised. This is not a symptom that LSD produces. Supporters of the CIA theory responded that the two explanations were not necessarily mutually exclusive. They argued that LSD could have been added to grain that was already contaminated with ergot, that the experiment may have been layered on top of a pre-existing contamination event, that both substances could have been present simultaneously, which would explain the full range of symptoms. This argument has never been proven and has never been disproven. What is documented is this: the CIA was running covert experiments with LSD on non-consenting subjects during exactly this period. This is not a theory. It is established historical fact confirmed by declassified government documents and congressional investigations in the 1970s. American citizens were dosed without their knowledge. Mental patients were dosed. Prisoners were dosed. The program operated on the assumption that the subject's consent was irrelevant to the goals of the research. Whether a small town in southern France was added to that list is the question that has never been answered. The French government has never reopened the official investigation into Pont Saint-Esprit. No formal inquiry has been launched in response to Albarelli's findings or the questions raised by researchers who followed him. The CIA has neither confirmed nor denied any involvement. The documents that could settle the question definitively remain either classified, destroyed, or somewhere in an archive that no one has yet succeeded in fully accessing. The survivors of the outbreak gave interviews over the years. Some lived into old age. They described August 1951 with a consistency that was itself striking. Not the facts, which they sometimes remembered differently, but the feeling. The sense that the world had become something that could not be trusted. That reality itself had turned unreliable. Several of them said they never fully lost that feeling. That something in that week had permanently changed the way they experienced ordinary life, the way they felt when they woke up in the morning, the way they looked at food before they ate it. Rock Bryan, the baker, was never charged with any crime. The investigation concluded that he had no knowledge of any contamination in his flour and bore no criminal responsibility for what had happened. He had been, in the official version of events, an unwitting link in a chain that began with a contaminated grain supply and ended with 200 people losing their minds. Whether that chain began in a field where ergot grew in a wet season, or in a laboratory where a government program was testing the limits of what could be done to a population without its knowledge, is a question that Pont Saint-Esprit has been asking for over 70 years. The town still stands on the bank of the Rhône. The bridge that gives it its name, the Bridge of the Holy Spirit, still crosses the river. People still live there, still buy bread, still go about the ordinary rhythms of daily life in a small southern French town. But somewhere in the gap between an official conclusion and the full truth, between a forensic result and what actually happened, between a classified document and what it actually says, the real story of August 1951 is either still waiting to be found, or it has already been made to disappear.